Happy Sabbath! How was your week? It was so hot, and I hope you all stay cool indoor and was hydrated. Tonight we're going to continue with the book Genesis, and chapter 35 it is. Let me start reading verse 1. God said to Jacob, "Arise, go up to Bethel and dwell there. Make an altar there to the God who appeared to you when you fled from your brother Esau." So Jacob said to his household and to all who were with him, "Put away the foreign gods that are among you, and purify yourselves and change your garments. Then let us arise and go up to Bethel, so that I may make there an altar to the God who answers me in the day of my distress, and has been with me wherever I have gone." So they gave to Jacob all the foreign gods that they had, and the rings that were in the ears. Jacob hid them under the terebinth tree that was near Shechem. I don't know whether you noticed the entire chapter 34, which is the previous chapter, didn't mention God, not even once. And in my opinion, that last chapter is one of the most disgusting chapters in Israel's history. However, in this chapter, Genesis 35, it mentioned God repeatedly, more than 10 times. Plus 11 more times God's name was in connection with Bethel and Israel. The Shechem catastrophe happened because Jacob went to Shechem instead of Bethel. Do you remember in Genesis 31 that God told him to return to Bethel? But then he made stop. He was in Shechem instead. So now at last, he is going where God wanted him to go. Another reason for the disaster in Shechem is because Jacob's children kept foreign gods because their mother did. Rachel kept the household gods of her father. If you recall when we were discussing Genesis 31, right? No matter how hard we try to teach our children godly conduct, they will continue to do what we do, not what we say. While they were in Shechem, Jacob's family had drifted away from God. After that horrid event in Shechem, God appeared and told Jacob to go to Bethel. And Jacob told his family to put away idols, to purify themselves, and to change their garments. This was an important step. Jacob and his family needed to leave foreign gods and all impurities behind. The meaning of changing the garments is both literal and symbolic. Throughout the Bible, garments symbolize character. They needed to change their polluted character in exchange for what is right in God's eyes. Why did they have to give up their earrings? Apparently, these earrings also had a pagan connection. This was something they picked up from the Canaanites. Jacob wanted them to be cleaned up and in the best frame of mind to come before the God they had neglected. Verse 5. As they journeyed, a terror from God fell upon the cities that were around them, so that they did not pursue the sons of Jacob. And Jacob came to Luz, that is Bethel, which is in the land of Canaan, he and all the people who were with him. And there he built an altar and called the place El Bethel, because there God had revealed himself to him when he fled from his brother. And Deborah, Rebekah's nurse, died, and she was buried under an oak below Bethel. So he called his name Elon Bethus. Jacob and his family needed this protection. What kind of protection? God sent terror upon the cities that were around them. Why do they need the protection? Because of the massacre that happened in Shechem, made them hated among the Canaanites. Now they arrived Bethel. The evangelist Spurgeon said he could almost picture the grateful delight of Jacob after he arrived Bethel as he looked on the stone pillar that he made or he laid down to sleep 20 years ago as a lonely young man. He remembered his many regrets, many confessions, many thanksgivings at Bethel. So he built an altar there and called that place El Bethel, meaning God in Bethel. Though Jacob had sinned, he now did what was right before God. Now about Rebekah's nurse. Who is she? When Rebekah left Haran to marry Isaac, she came with Rebekah as a companion. Obviously, she was a beloved member of the family because they named the place where she was buried Elon Becketh, which means oak of weeping. Verse 9. God appeared to Jacob again when he came from Paddan Aram and blessed him. And God said to him, "Your name is Jacob. No longer shall your name be called Jacob, but Israel shall be your name." So he called his name Israel. And God said to him, "I am God Almighty. Be fruitful and multiply. A nation and a company of nations shall come from you, and kings shall come from your own body. The land that I gave to Abraham, Isaac, I will give to you, and I will give the land to your offspring after you." Then God went up from him in the place where he had spoken with him. And Jacob set up a pillar in the place where he had spoken with him, a pillar of stone. He poured out a drink offering on it and poured oil on it. So Jacob called the name of the place where God had spoken with him Bethel. God appeared to Jacob again. Relationship was restored. This was an excellent example of what it means to return to your first love, as it mentioned in Revelation chapter 2. Do you remember that? God told the people in Ephesus, the Christian Ephesus, to return to your first love. Here Jacob returned to his first love, the Lord. And Jacob repented by getting rid of all the idols and put on new garments. And he did the first important work by building an altar and worshiping God as he had done before. And now at this point, God reminded him of his new name. The reminder was important. Perhaps Jacob had been acting like the old Jacob instead of Israel. God wanted to set his mind on the new man that God made him to be. So God reminded him, Israel shall be your name, meaning you're no longer the deceiver. You have struggled with God and man, and you've overcome. And furthermore, God reiterated his promise to Jacob. He said, the land which I gave Abraham and Isaac, I give to you and to your descendants. After you, I give this land. God granted Jacob a precious reminder of his place in God's great covenant. The covenant that started with his grandfather Abraham and then Isaac and now him. In this, Jacob did not need to hear anything new from God. He just needed to be reminded of what was true and be encouraged to cling to it all. And then God went up from him in the place where he talked with him. It sounded like God appeared to Jacob here in bodily form. God blessed Jacob remarkably after his return to his first love. Much blessing waits for us too. And that is not until we do what God tells us to do. And so here Jacob poured a drink offering on the altar, and he poured oil on it. Appropriately, Jacob performed sacrificial acts of worship to the God who had blessed him so much. So what is this drink offering? The idea of drink offering is found in several places in the Bible: Exodus, Leviticus, and Numbers. And all these places show that the drink offering was made with wine poured out in sacrifice before the Lord at his altar. And Paul also explained. He said that he considered himself to be like the drink offering pouring out before God. What he means is dedicating himself, surrendering himself. So Jacob here was rededicating himself to God. Verse 16. Then they journeyed from Bethel. When they were still some distance from Ephrath, Rachel went into labor, and she had hard labor. And when her labor was at its hardest, the midwife said to her, "Do not fear, for you have another son." And as her soul was departing, for she was dying, she called his name Ben-Oni, but his father called him Benjamin. So Rachel died, and she was buried on the way to Ephrath, that is Bethlehem. And Jacob set up a pillar over her tomb. It is the pillar of Rachel's tomb, which is there to this day. Israel journeyed on and pitched his tent beyond the tower of Eder. Rachel, Joseph's mother and Jacob's favorite wife, died giving birth to her second son, Benjamin. The report about the birth of this youngest son is separated from the rest of the birth of other son. Remember, we talk about the birth of other son in chapter 29 and chapter 30, right? But yet here it follows closely on that passage. It's like a continuation, initially talk about Jacob's 11th son, how he was born to whom, but now the last son, the 12th one. So according to the previous chapters, the last son to have been born was Rachel's first son, Joseph. At that time, during Joseph's birth, Rachel had said, if you recall, "May the Lord add to me another son." Apparently, looking back at that request, Rachel's wish had come true. So Rachel's midwife said, "Don't be afraid. See, your wish had come through. You have another son." But then she was dying. So as she was about to die, Rachel named her son Ben-Oni, meaning son of my trouble or son of my sorrow. Why did Rachel call her son's name Ben-Oni? Son of my sorrow or son of my trouble? Remember in the previous chapters, Rachel and her older sister Leah were competing for status in the household. They compared each other of who was bearing more sons for Jacob. In giving birth to another son, it should have been a cause for rejoicing and victory for Rachel. But it was not a joyous occasion because she was dying. She would not be able to live to the day when this child grew up. Ultimately, this shows the futility of Rachel's competition with her sister Leah. Now, at the time of her final victory, all she found was sorrow. But Jacob, in his wisdom, called the second son of Rachel Benjamin, which means son of my right hand. And this has the idea of son of my strength or son of my honor. Perhaps he rightly sensed the special place that God had for this child. Or perhaps he simply prized Benjamin so greatly because he was the final link between him and the women he most loved. The site of Rachel's burial, Ephrath, was clearly identified with the city of Bethlehem. And this was an important place in biblical history. And we're going to talk about Bethlehem later on in the Bible. Samuel, 1 Samuel, Micah, and then Jeremiah, and then Matthew. Now verse 22. While Israel lived in that land, Reuben went and lay with Bilhah, his father's concubine, and Israel heard of it. Another puzzling event. The passage stopped mid-sentence near the end of verse 22, leaving us without resolution. So what happened? So what does this mean? And what were the consequences of Reuben's action? We learn later that Reuben lost his birthright because he defiled his father's marriage bed. Clearly, this kind of sexual transgression is forbidden in Moses' law. We could read that in Leviticus chapter 18 and Deuteronomy chapter 27. But the story seems to be about more than just sexual immorality. Rabbinic literature tells us that Reuben's aim or Reuben's goal was to protect the rights of Leah as the principal wife by defiling Bilhah. You see, Bilhah was Rachel's servant girl, Jacob's concubine. So when Rachel died, he didn't want Bilhah to claim the first wife's status. So in order to protect his mother Leah, Reuben did what he did. This is some of the scholars' interpretation. But then there's also other interpretation that Reuben was laying claim to his father's estate by claiming his father's property before his father died. And that's why he went to lay with Bilhah, his father's concubine. So in this way, Reuben was challenging his father's authority to lead the clan. Although the Hebrew leaves us hanging, the story is not over, and we'll read it later that Reuben's action did not go unnoticed. It resulted in the revocation of his birthright, and the birthright was transferred to Joseph, Rachel's firstborn. Continue reading now. End of verse 22, and then onward to 23 to 26. Now the sons of Jacob were 12. The sons of Leah, Reuben, Jacob's firstborn, Simeon, Levi, Judah, Issachar, and Zebulun. The sons of Rachel, Joseph, and Benjamin. The sons of Bilhah, Rachel's servant, Dan and Naphtali. The sons of Zilpah, Leah's servant, Gad and Asher. These were the sons of Jacob who were born to him in Padan Aram. Here it reiterates Jacob's son by his wives and his wives' servants. So the birth of Benjamin completes the family of Jacob. Now there are 12. But it doesn't mean that Benjamin was born in Padan Aram, but it just reiterates the 12 sons of Jacob. Now verse 27. And Jacob came to his father Isaac at Mamre, or Kiriath Arba, that is Hebron, where Abraham and Isaac had sojourned. And now the days of Isaac were 180 years. And Isaac breathed his last, and he died and was gathered to his people, old and full of days. And his sons Esau and Jacob buried him. So it came a full circle. So this is the end of Jacob's narratives. And this end of his story is marked by the death of his father Isaac. Well, this is mentioned not just to record Isaac's death, but to show the complete fulfillment of God's promise to Jacob in chapter 28. According to Jacob's vow, he had asked that God watched over him during his sojourn and return him safely to the house of his father. And therefore, the conclusion of the story, Jacob's story, marked the final fulfillment of these words as Jacob returned to the house of his father, Isaac, before he died. And then the passage said his sons Esau and Jacob buried him. The two sons has already been brought together by God's hand. They reconciled. And now they work together again, united by the death of their father. So in summary, what does this narrative tell us about God's character? Like I mentioned just now, we noticed there was no mention of God in chapter 34. But chapter 35 mentioned God repeatedly, more than 10 times, plus 11 more times God's name was in connection with Bethel and Israel. Why? For sure, God is never absent from his people. Yet, it is as if God steps off the page for a moment to distance himself in Genesis chapter 34. In chapter 34, Jacob's son acted wickedly. And there, Jacob remembered God's instruction. He returned to God. Now in Genesis 35, God appeared again. He reminded Jacob of his new name. The reminder of the new name was important because Jacob had acted like his old self instead of Israel, instead of being the Israel that God had named him. God wanted to set his mind on the new man God made him to be. So, do you know whether God does the same with us? Reminding us who we are in him? He does want us to remember and live in the great names that he gave us. And does this narrative reflect the nature of humans? Misfortune, pain, and suffering often shatter men and women's illusion that all is well. These tragic events also shatter our illusion that we are self-sufficient. Everyone has noticed how hard it is to turn our thoughts to God when everything is going so well with us. We have all we want, and sadly, that all does not include God. And sometimes we even find God an interruption. Shechem was a very good example. In Shechem, God was silent. Perhaps God wanted to offer something to Jacob and his family, but he couldn't because Jacob's life was too occupied. You see, after Jacob's reconciliation with Esau, he had nothing more to worry or fearful about, so he had no time for God. And this is what C.S. Lewis said. Now God, who has made us, knows what we are and that our happiness lies in him. Yet we will not seek it in him as long as he leaves us any other resort where it can even plausibly be looked for. While what we call our own life remains agreeable, we will not surrender it to him. What then can God do in our interests that make our own life less agreeable to us and take away the plausible source of false happiness? And so, how shall we live? After the atrocity in chapter 34, what did Jacob do? He repented. He turned away from his sin and turned toward God. And he removed his old garments, the idols, indicating that he removed his old life. and then he returned to God. And he rebuilt an altar, meaning to re-establish commitment to God. And then Jacob was reminded of his new name, his new character. It is no longer the deceiver, but it's the one who wrestled with God and man and overcome. We should also remember of our own identity, our new identity after we become followers or disciples of Christ. Our identity as the sons and daughters of God. Happy Sabbath.